Long before the Flying Dutchman had a name, a captain, or a fixed course through the southern oceans, it existed as a feeling. Sailors felt it first in the tightening of the gut, when the horizon refused to stay still, when wind and cloud seemed to conspire, when the sea looked too calm or too violent to be trusted. On long voyages, weeks from land, stories were as essential as fresh water. They warned, entertained, and disciplined. Among these stories grew the idea that some ships did not return, not because they sank, but because they were refused permission to do so. Early seafaring cultures shared a belief that the sea was not empty but governed. Ancient mariners spoke of boundaries that should not be crossed lightly, of routes that demanded humility. When a ship vanished without wreckage or survivors, the explanation rarely stopped at storms or reefs. Something had intervened. The ship had offended. It had been judged. In this climate, the notion of a vessel condemned to wander forever did not feel fanciful. It felt instructional. Sailors told such stories not to scare themselves senseless, but to remember that the sea kept accounts. Punishment was a familiar concept aboard ship. Discipline was harsh and public, because survival depended on obedience. Mutiny, blasphemy, or defiance of authority were crimes that threatened everyone on board. It is no accident that many early versions of the Flying Dutchman myth center on a captain who refuses to heed warnings, whether divine, natural, or human. He sails on when others would turn back. He swears when others pray. The idea that such a man would be denied rest mirrors the justice sailors understood. Eternal wandering was simply punishment scaled to the crime. These early tales did not yet feature a glowing ship or a specific coastline. They were looser, more fluid, shaped by the teller and the night in which they were told. Around a creaking table below deck, with lantern lights swinging and the sound of waves pressing in from all sides, a sailor might describe seeing a distant sail that never drew closer, or a ship that vanished when hailed. Another would add that such a sight meant bad luck, illness, or death before the voyage was done. Each retelling sharpened the edges, reinforcing the sense that the sea could show you things it did not mean you to understand. Crucially, these stories often arose from exhaustion and isolation. Early long-distance sailing pushed human endurance beyond familiar limits. Sleep came in fragments. Men stared at the horizon for hours, primed to interpret any anomaly as meaningful. When a sail appeared where no ship should be, or lights flickered on a distant line of darkness, the mind reached for an explanation. Oral tradition supplied one ready-made. A ghost ship was easier to grasp than the possibility that the eyes themselves were unreliable. Religion also fed the myth's early growth. In Protestant and Catholic seafaring communities alike, the idea of a soul trapped between worlds was well established. Purgatory, damnation, divine wrath, these were not abstract theological concepts but lived realities, discussed daily and feared sincerely. To imagine a ship as a cursed entity was simply to extend those beliefs into a maritime frame. The sea already represented chaos and judgment. A ship that could not dock, could not sink, and could not reach heaven or hell fit neatly into that worldview. The Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, among the earliest European powers to push deep into unknown waters, carried these beliefs with them. Language barriers did not prevent the sharing of superstition. In ports, sailors swapped stories as readily as cargo. A tale heard in one tongue emerged altered in another, but its core survived. A ship doomed to sail forever because of a grievous offense. Over time, the idea became less about any single vessel, and more about the sea's capacity to remember wrongdoing. What makes the Flying Dutchman distinct, even in its earliest forms, is that it is not merely a ghost. Ghosts belong to the past. They revisit. The cursed ship, by contrast, is trapped in the present, endlessly repeating motion without progress. For sailors, this was perhaps the most terrifying fate imaginable. A voyage without landfall, without conclusion, mirrored their deepest fear that they might sail beyond the edges of the known world and never find their way back. These early narratives were reinforced by the practice of using fear as a tool of order. Older sailors warned younger ones that reckless behavior could attract the attention of such cursed vessels. Whistling into the wind, mocking the sea, sailing on holy days, these small acts were said to invite disaster. The Flying Dutchman became a floating cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance had consequences far beyond a single lifetime. Importantly, no single authority defined the story at this stage. There was no official account, no written canon. The myth lived entirely in voices, gestures, and shared glances. In some tellings, the ship appeared pristine, sails full and crew visible but silent. In others, it was rotting, barely held together, its presence accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature or an unnatural stillness. What mattered was not consistency, but effect. The story needed to feel plausible enough to be believed and vague enough to accommodate new experiences. By the time ships began to range farther and stay at sea longer, these early whispers had already done their work. Sailors were primed to interpret certain sights as signs. A distant silhouette at dusk, a reflection on low clouds, a ship that failed to respond to signals. These could all slot easily into the existing framework. The Flying Dutchman did not arrive fully formed. It assembled itself piece by piece, drawing strength from fear, belief, and the human need to explain what refuses to be explained. As oral tradition carried the story forward, it slowly accumulated weight. What began as a warning became an expectation. If the sea could curse a man, why not a ship? If a ship could be cursed, why would it ever be allowed to rest? In this way, the Flying Dutchman emerged, not as a single legend, but as a shared understanding and agreement among sailors that some voyages never truly end, and that the ocean keeps the worst of them alive, moving endlessly just beyond reach. Why does a ghost story, a simple maritime legend, haunt one specific corner of our planet? The tale of the Flying Dutchman didn't just drift randomly across the world's oceans. It found an anchor point, a place where fear, geography, and history collided with terrifying force. That place is the southern tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans clash around the Cape of Good Hope. Long before it became infamous in song and story, the Cape was already a proving ground. For sailors rounding it in the age of sail, success or failure often depended on forces no chart could ever tame. The Cape's reputation was earned quickly and brutally. The winds there are erratic and violent, funneled by a huge landmass and opposing ocean currents. Storms can erupt with almost no warning, turning calm seas into monstrous walls of water. Imagine this. Your ship has already been at sea for months. The hull is strained, the crew is weak from scurvy and exhaustion, and just when you think the worst is over, you reach the Cape. This isn't the end of your hardship. It's the beginning of a deadly negotiation with nature itself. If you turn back too late, you're trapped. This is the exact environment where the Flying Dutchman became fixed to a single, cursed route. Sailors didn't imagine the ghost ship wandering aimlessly across all oceans. They placed it right here, where the odds were worst, where a captain's stubbornness was tested daily. The idea of a captain who refused to turn back during a Cape storm felt not only believable, but terrifyingly familiar. Many sailors had served under men who pushed too hard, driven by profit, pride, or the fear of disgrace. The myth mirrored reality so closely, it felt more like a historical account than a fable. The Dutch presence in these waters only sharpened the legend. Dutch trading companies ran vast fleets through the Cape. Their schedules were rigid, their expectations incredibly high. Captains were rewarded for speed and punished for any delay. A storm that forced a retreat could ruin a career. In this pressure cooker, the image of a Dutch captain who defied the weather and paid an eternal price took a powerful hold. The nationality mattered less than the association with relentless commerce and uncompromising authority. Sailors rounding the Cape often described seeing ships where none should be. A vessel might appear ahead, sailing directly into the wind with impossible ease, only to vanish as the observer's own ship changed course. In a region known for sudden squalls and shifting light, these sightings carried extra weight. The Cape already felt cursed. Adding a ghost ship to its waters seemed less like an invention and more like an acknowledgement of something already deeply wrong with the place. Navigation itself played a huge role. Before reliable longitude calculation, ships relied on dead reckoning and experience. Near the Cape, heavy clouds often hid the stars, and strong currents could push vessels miles off course without the crew even realizing it. A sailor, convinced he knew his position, might spot a sail and assume it belonged to a known route, only to discover later that no ship should have been there. The mystery demanded an explanation, and the legend of the Flying Dutchman provided a chilling one. The very behavior of the storms at the Cape reinforced this narrative of defiance and punishment. The winds could lock a ship in place for days, driving it backward even with its sails full. Crews told stories of battling headwinds so fierce that progress felt impossible, as if the sea itself were refusing them passage. In that context, the image of a ship, eternally trying and eternally failing to round the Cape, resonated on a profound level. The Flying Dutchman became a symbol of that struggle, the embodiment of what happens when willpower is mistaken for mastery over nature. As you might expect, the superstition surrounding the Cape grew with every voyage. To sight the Flying Dutchman there was considered especially ominous. It wasn't just a spooky encounter, it was a prophecy. Some believed it foretold shipwreck, others, disease or death among the crew. The location intensified the meaning. Seeing a ghost ship in calmer waters might be unsettling, but seeing it off the Cape of Good Hope felt like a final verdict being delivered. Soon, accounts from different nations began to overlap in this very region. English, French, and Scandinavian sailors all reported similar stories after passing the Cape, even if they called the ship by different names. Over time, these narratives blended together. The cursed captain's defiance became more explicit in the telling. He was said to have sworn a powerful oath to round the Cape, even if it took him until Judgment Day. Whether anyone believed this literally mattered less than the way it captured the emotional truth of the voyage. Many sailors felt they were already trapped in a cycle of attempt and failure, at the complete mercy of winds that simply did not care. Life aboard the ship during these passages only tightened the myth's grip. Crews were often exhausted to the point of hallucination. Rations would run dangerously low. Morale would fracture under the constant, crushing stress. In these conditions, a shared belief became a form of survival. If everyone agreed that certain signs meant danger, they could prepare for it together. The Flying Dutchman was one of those signs, a narrative shortcut that allowed fear to be named, shared, and managed. Even captains who dismissed superstition couldn't escape its influence entirely. To ignore a crew's fears risked mutiny. Some would order extra prayers, others a change of course, if only to restore confidence. In this way, the myth had a very real, practical influence on the age of sail. Decisions were shaped not just by wind and wave, but by the stories carried into the storm. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Cape of Good Hope and the Flying Dutchman were inseparable in the maritime world. One reinforced the other. The Cape was dangerous because cursed things happened there. Cursed things happened there because the Cape was dangerous. This circular logic sustained itself for generations, carried from ship to ship, port to port, becoming more embellished with each telling. What emerged was not just a ghost story, but a geographical legend, rooted in a specific place where human ambition met its absolute limits. The Flying Dutchman became inseparable from the act of rounding the Cape itself, a constant, ghostly reminder that some waters do not forgive, and that pushing forward at all costs could trap a man or a ship in a journey with no end in sight. As the legend of the Flying Dutchman settled into the routines of long-distance sailing, it began to leave traces in places sailors trusted more than stories. Their logbooks. These weren't works of imagination, but working documents meant to record wind, course, damage, and discipline. Yet scattered among these practical entries are moments where something strange intrudes, brief notes about mysterious sails, inexplicable lights, ships seen and then lost. The language is often cautious, almost reluctant, as if the writer knew they were stepping into uncertain territory. A lookout might report a vessel on the horizon at dusk, its outline sharp against the fading light. The officer of the watch would note it, maybe alter course slightly, and expect to exchange signals. Then, nothing. The ship would fade, dissolve into mist, or vanish behind a wave that shouldn't have been high enough to hide it. In the logbook, this might appear as a single stark line, sighted sail ahead, lost from view, no embellishment, no mention of curses. But for a crew already steeped in tradition, the implication was clear. Over time, these entries accumulated. They didn't all describe the same ship, nor did they always happen near the Cape of Good Hope, but patterns started to emerge. Many sightings occurred at twilight or dawn, those tricky hours when the eye struggles to judge distance. Others took place after storms, when the air was heavy with moisture and the horizon seemed to bend and distort. The sheer repetition gave the phenomenon a kind of credibility. If different crews, on different ships, kept recording similar experiences, something had to be happening, even if no one could agree on what it was. What these sailors were encountering, unknowingly, were optical effects common at sea, but poorly understood at the time. One of the most significant was a form of atmospheric refraction, where layers of air with different temperatures can act like a lens. This could lift distant objects above the horizon or project their images into the air. A ship far beyond normal visibility could suddenly appear much closer, larger, even suspended in the sky. To an observer without modern optics or meteorological knowledge, the effect felt supernatural. The ship looked real because, in a way, it was real, just displaced by layers of air bending light in unfamiliar ways. Another phenomenon played tricks in low light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, its rays skimmed the atmosphere at shallow angles, exaggerating contrasts and sharpening silhouettes. A distant cloud bank could easily resemble a line of sails. The crest of a large wave might mimic the dark line of a hole. The brain, conditioned by expectation and exhaustion, filled in the gaps. Once the impression of a ship formed, the eye would search for confirmation, and it would often find it, whether it was truly there or not, and we can't overstate the role of fatigue in these accounts. Sailors stood watch for hours, sometimes for days, with minimal rest. Their vision adapted poorly to darkness, and their concentration frayed. Under these conditions, misperception wasn't a failure of character, it was an inevitability. Yet, when several men on deck saw the same thing, it became much harder to dismiss. Collective sightings carried weight, even if each person's individual perception was subtly different. Some logbooks even go further, describing attempts to communicate. They talk of raising signal flags, showing lanterns, even firing cannons, but there was never a response. In the rigid etiquette of the sea, such silence was deeply unsettling. Ships were expected to acknowledge one another, if only to confirm their presence. A vessel that ignored signals violated an unspoken code, and that violation pushed the encounter from merely odd toward being a dark omen. Even highly trained naval officers, taught to observe carefully, sometimes added their own commentary to the logs. A few expressed skepticism, noting the possibility of weather effects or errors in judging distance, but many others simply recorded what their eyes told them, unwilling to speculate. That very restraint is telling. These were men accustomed to risk, not easily shaken, yet something about these sightings resisted any easy explanation. As the 18th century progressed, improvements in record-keeping brought more detail. Times, bearings, and weather conditions were noted with increasing precision. Ironically, this didn't banish the mystery, it actually refined it. The more exact the data became, the clearer it was that these sightings clustered under specific atmospheric circumstances. But without the science to connect cause and effect, the conclusion remained open. The Flying Dutchman slipped neatly into that gap between observation and understanding. The phenomenon known as looming, where refraction makes distant objects appear elevated and closer, explains many classic descriptions of the phantom ship. A vessel sailing far beyond the horizon could suddenly appear fully visible, sails bright, hull distinct only to disappear abruptly as the atmospheric conditions shifted. To a sailor, this sudden vanishing felt active, intentional. Ships didn't just blink out of existence. It felt like something had chosen to withdraw. Mirages could also invert images, making ships appear upside down or strangely distorted. Such sights were reported with particular unease. A vessel sailing keel up defied the very laws of nature as they were understood. Even when an observer recognized the image as bizarre, the mind instinctively reached for a story to contain it. A cursed ship, unbound by the normal rules of the world, fit the experience far better than some abstract atmospheric explanation. But what truly transformed these visual tricks into an enduring legend was not the illusion itself, but the meaning that sailors attached to it. They carried expectations shaped by years of storytelling around the fire or on the forecastle. When a strange illusion in the mist matched the outline of the Flying Dutchman they had heard about since their first voyage, recognition came instantly. The sight didn't create the legend framed the sight. This framing also influenced memory. Accounts written days or weeks after an event often grew more detailed than the initial log entry. What had been simply a sail lost from view could become, in retelling, a full-rigged ship under all canvas that was completely unresponsive. Then, in port, over a drink, the details would harden into fact. The logbook anchored the story in reality. The telling filled it with meaning. Even as science advanced, the authority of first-hand observation remained incredibly strong. Sailors trusted their own eyes far more than distant theorists in universities. If something looked solid, moved like a ship, and followed the rules of the sea right, until it didn't, then it occupied a strange middle ground. It wasn't quite an illusion, but not quite a vessel either. The Flying Dutchman inhabited that space comfortably. By the time scholars began to propose atmospheric explanations in earnest, the legend was already reinforced by generations of recorded encounters. To dismiss it outright felt like dismissing the lived experiences of countless sailors. And so the myth persisted, not in opposition to observation, but completely intertwined with it. The Flying Dutchman was no longer just a scary story. It was a conclusion drawn from evidence that seemed to demand one. In this way, the logbooks and the illusions worked together, unknowingly, to keep the ship sailing. The sea offered up images that challenged perception, sailors recorded them honestly, and tradition supplied the interpretation. Between the bending of light and the weight of belief, a phantom vessel continued to appear on the horizon, solid enough to be seen, elusive enough to be doubted, and enduring enough to pass from one generation to the next, never fully resolving into truth or fiction. How does a ghost story whispered by sailors become a global phenomenon? It gets written down. That's exactly what happened to the Flying Dutchman. As more and more naval officers learned to read and write, the legend jumped from salty sea tales and private logbooks into published books, official reports, and letters home. This didn't tame the story, it supercharged it. Suddenly, accounts of a phantom ship weren't just rumors, they were printed in black and white, giving them a sense of permanence and authority. The legend started looking less like a sailor's superstition and more like a real, recurring mystery that needed an explanation. Think about the men writing these reports. We're talking about explorers and naval officers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These guys were the scientists of their day, expected to be rational and objective. Yet, they worked on the open ocean, a place full of uncertainty, where science couldn't explain everything. So when a respected officer recorded seeing a strange vessel sailing directly into a gale-force wind, a ship that wouldn't answer signals and then vanished into thin air, people on land paid attention. These weren't just tall tales from the deckhands. They were observations from trained professionals whose careers depended on being accurate. What's fascinating is how restrained many of these early accounts were. An officer wouldn't usually write about a cursed captain or a crew of skeletons. Instead, he'd just lay out the facts. A ship seen in impossible conditions, its sudden disappearance, the eerie silence. This low-key, factual tone was powerful. It left room for the reader's imagination to fill in the blanks, and many people filled them with the familiar ghost story they already knew. As more of these accounts were published, a pattern started to form. Certain phrases kept popping up in different reports from different authors. Unnatural speed, silent crew, lost in a haze. It's like a game of telephone across the oceans. Whether they realized it or not, writers began borrowing from each other, using a shared vocabulary to describe these strange encounters. This process helped standardize the legend. The Flying Dutchman started to gain a consistent set of characteristics, not because everyone was seeing the exact same phantom, but because they were all using the same words to describe it. Literature then threw gasoline on the fire. Novelists and storytellers grabbed these maritime accounts and wove them into thrilling narratives that blurred the line between fact and fiction. Some of these books were even marketed as true stories, just slightly dramatized for effect. For the millions of people who had never set foot on a ship, this was their first introduction to the legend. The Flying Dutchman became a household name, familiar even to those who'd never tasted salt spray. This era also gave us the definitive version of the captain. While earlier tales varied, he now became a distinct character, a defiant, blasphemous Dutch captain, cursed for an act of incredible arrogance, usually refusing to turn back from a storm. Giving the ship a captain with a motive and a tragic backstory made the legend so much more compelling. A ghostly ship is spooky, but a ship guided by a damned soul is the stuff of epic tragedy. His story became a moral lesson about pride and the punishment that follows. The story gained even more credibility when high-profile people reported sightings. When a prince or a high-ranking admiral claimed to have seen the ghost ship, it became much harder to dismiss. Even the biggest skeptics had to pause and think. If these respected, powerful men were seeing the same thing that sailors had been whispering about for centuries, maybe there was something to it after all. Of course, this was also the age of reason, so skepticism was growing. Some people tried to explain the sightings away as mirages, mass hallucinations, or simply mistaking another ship for the phantom. But here's the interesting part. These skeptical explanations didn't kill the legend, they became part of it. The debate itself, is it real or not, kept the Flying Dutchman in the public conversation, making the story even more famous. The argument became part of its texture. As the story was written down and retold, it adapted to the times. The most over-the-top supernatural elements, like glowing hulls or see-through crews, were often toned down. Instead, the focus shifted to the ship's inexplicable behavior, its impossible speed, its ability to sail against the wind. This made the legend more resilient. It could survive in a world that was becoming more scientific and less comfortable with literal ghosts. It presented itself not as a ghost story, but as an unsolved maritime mystery. This feedback loop even affected the sailors themselves. Imagine you're a sailor who saw something strange off the coast of Africa. You might have doubted your own eyes. But then you pick up a book and read an account from a naval officer describing the exact same thing. Suddenly, your personal experience feels validated. It fits into a known pattern. The legend, born on the waves, was now being reinforced by the printed page and sent right back out to sea. By the middle of the 19th century, the Flying Dutchman was everywhere. It was in naval histories, adventure novels, scientific journals, and popular magazines. It wasn't just a sailor's yarn anymore, but it hadn't been completely debunked by science either. It existed in this strange, fascinating space between folklore and fact. Each retelling cemented certain details while leaving others open to interpretation. But through all these changes, one thing remained constant: the sense of a fleeting, mysterious encounter. The Flying Dutchman was never captured, boarded, or proven. It was always met at a distance, in bad weather, under confusing circumstances. The written accounts preserved this quality perfectly. In a way, the very act of writing the legend down, which was meant to bring clarity, ended up guaranteeing its mystery. It hardened the story, gave it the authority of print, but didn't solve it. The ambiguity that gave the legend its power in the first place was now preserved in ink. And so, the Flying Dutchman sailed on, leaving a wake of written words, forever carrying the mystery that gave it life. When modern science finally set its sights on the sea, the legend of the Flying Dutchman didn't need curses or ghosts to stay afloat. It had evolved into a powerful symbol, flexible enough to embrace new explanations without losing its mystique. With tools like meteorology, optics, and psychology things earlier, sailors could only dream of we could finally begin to separate what was seen from what was believed. But here's the fascinating part. The legend didn't just vanish under the bright light of scientific scrutiny. It transformed. Take atmospheric refraction, for instance. What was once just a strange curiosity became something measurable, even predictable. Scientists figured out how layers of warm and cold air could act like a giant lens, bending light over incredible distances. This is how a ship, physically miles beyond the horizon, could suddenly appear in view, sometimes stretched or distorted into an eerie, uncanny shape. And where did these phantom ships appear most often? Places with volatile weather and sharp temperature changes, like the infamous Cape of Good Hope. Suddenly, the Cape wasn't just a treacherous stretch of water. It was the perfect natural stage for this optical illusion. In this new light, the Flying Dutchman wasn't a cursed vessel at all, but an image of projection painted on the air by the laws of physics. Of course, physics only explains the how. What about the who? That's where psychology comes in. The human mind is a powerful and sometimes unreliable narrator. Imagine a sailor, already on edge, primed by tales of doom and disaster. In the vast, disorienting emptiness of the ocean, any strange shimmer on the horizon could be interpreted as a threat. When an entire crew shares these stories, their collective belief reinforces what they think they see. This isn't about being foolish or dishonest. It's just how our brains work under extreme stress. The legend of the Flying Dutchman became a perfect case study in how our expectations can literally shape our reality. But even with these solid scientific explanations, the story refused to die. Science could explain how a ghost ship might appear, but it couldn't fully explain why this particular image. The Flying Dutchman endured for centuries while countless other sea tales faded away. Part of the answer lies in the story's moral core. The Flying Dutchman isn't just a spooky visual effect, it's a powerful story about defiance, about a captain who dared to challenge nature, or even God, and was condemned to sail forever as punishment. It's a cautionary tale about the devastating cost of hubris, of ignoring the limits of our own power. These themes, punishment, obsession, eternal wandering, are timeless. They resonated just as deeply long after wooden sailing ships were replaced by steam and steel. This is why the legend found a new home in art, literature, and music. Composers like Richard Wagner and writers from Washington Irving to the creators of Pirates of the Caribbean did you need their audiences to believe in a literal ghost ship. They used the Flying Dutchman as a potent metaphor for obsession, for exile, for the inescapable consequences of our choices. The ship was no longer sailing on water, but through the vast ocean of human imagination, and its journey was just as relentless. Each retelling might emphasize a different facet of the story: a romantic tragedy, a tale of existential despair, but they all drew power from that same core image forged in the fear and wonder of the open sea. And what about the sailors themselves? Maritime culture kept the legend alive in its own quiet way. Even with GPS and advanced navigation, sailors continued to share stories. Maybe they didn't call it the Flying Dutchman, but they spoke of strange lights on the water, impossible silhouettes against the dawn, and eerie moments when the sea seemed to show them something impossible, only to snatch it away. Modern crews might chalk it up to fatigue or a trick of the light, but that primal, emotional response, that mix of awe, unease, and the feeling of being watched by something immense and ancient remains the same. The Flying Dutchman also became a useful bridge between different worlds of thought. It allowed scientists to explain complex optical phenomena using a story everyone already knew. It gave historians a lens to understand the real, lived experiences of sailors, their fears, their beliefs, their psychology, not just their shipping routes and cargo manifests. And it gave artists a ready-made symbol, loaded with centuries of meaning. Very few legends have proven to be so adaptable, so capable of holding new meanings without breaking. So, where do we draw the line between myth and observation? In the case of the Flying Dutchman, there isn't a clear line. It's more like a gradient. At one end, you have the hard data, light bending, weather patterns, the biology of the human eye. At the other end, you have the stories we tell to make sense of it all. The Flying Dutchman sails right down the middle, in that fascinating space where raw observation becomes a personal experience, and that experience is woven into a narrative. If you take away the story, you're left with cold, meaningless data. If you take away the data, you're left with pure fantasy. It's the combination of the two that creates something truly enduring. The ship's curse, its refusal to ever make port, perfectly mirrors its role in our culture. It never quite arrives at a final, definitive explanation, but it never vanishes from sight either. Each generation encounters it in a new way, armed with new knowledge, but still facing the same fundamental uncertainties. The sea is still vast and mysterious. Our perception is still imperfect, and our curiosity is limitless. In that space between what we know and what we wonder, the Flying Dutchman continues its endless voyage. When you strip away all the supernatural trappings, the legend reveals something profoundly human. It's a story about how we confront environments that are overwhelmingly powerful, how we use narratives to create a sense of order in a chaotic world, and how those stories can persist and evolve even as our understanding grows. The ghost ship isn't some relic of an irrational past clinging to the present. It's a symbol of continuity, a powerful reminder that a scientific explanation doesn't have to erase our sense of wonder. So, in the end, the Flying Dutchman is neither a complete myth nor a hidden history. It is a living record of the timeless encounter between the human mind and an unforgiving world. Its sails are woven from threads of light and belief. Its course is plotted by fear, hope, and the boundless power of imagination. Long after the last great sailing ships rounded the Cape, the image of the ghost ship endures, not because it defies explanation, but because it survives it. It remains forever, just visible enough to be seen, and just elusive enough to be remembered.